I'm Travis, and we've got a special guest with us today. We have Jeff Ash from the Non Diet Companion. And Jeff is a very cool individual. I've had a chance to talk to him quite a bit here locally. Um, hello, Jeff, first of all.
Hey, that's a nice introduction. I don't know if my kids would agree with you, but certainly happy to hear that I'm a cool guy.
Well, I will definitely give it to you for one, I guess, uncool guy to another, maybe. I don't know. But I just to tell you a little bit about Jeff before I let him take the floor and really run with it. Jeff has motivated a lot of changes in my personal life, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. But I found your podcast when it was called Men's Intuition
Mhm.
totally by mistake, total not by mistake, but totally by chance, and I started listening to it, and it's like, man, this all right. What he's saying makes sense. Well, you talk about a type of, um, I'm not going to call it dieting, a way of fitness that is called intuitive eating, and I'll let you get into that. But after having discovered your podcast and your information, and now your app and everything, um, I'm down about 16 pounds in about 2.5 months, which, that's not huge for some people, but for me it is. And it's still moving forward. But anyway, so Jeff, tell us about you, where you're at, what you do, and how uh, how we can learn from intuitive eating.
Yeah, sure. So I live in Houston, Texas, and I kind of wear a few different hats. So one of those is I'm a nutritionist and personal trainer, and I focus my work using this framework that we'll talk a little bit about called intuitive eating, which is significantly different than the typical fitness approach, the diet and exercise approach that most people are promoting now. It's certainly much different than a lot of your like low carb and keto things with rigid rules and restriction and those kinds of things, which we'll talk more about. And but in addition to that, I'm also a software engineer. It's kind of a weird mix of kind of geeky software engineering and then helping people unpack their relationship with food and working kind of in a counseling type of a role there. But as a software engineer, as you mentioned, I do have an app, and so I have merged kind of the two uh, passions that I have, which is I love both doing both kinds of work. And so I've created an app called the Non-Diet Companion, which is an app specifically to help people who are adopting this intuitive eating and non-diet approach to their health and fitness and nutrition to kind of help them uh, apply those different principles that we'll talk a little bit about here and journal about those things. Journaling is kind of a big helpful part of the intuitive eating process because it often involves some reflection and digging down and getting to kind of what's at the root of the issue. So whereas dieting often is, hey, what diet should I start? And people throw out recommendations, and you just say, oh, that sounds good. I think I'll try that, and without first figuring out, well, what is it that I need to actually address? And so intuitive eating helps you do that. The app kind of comes alongside you. Basically, the name says it all. It's a companion to help you on that non-diet journey.
Well, I know that one of the things that has always turned me off to the thought of a diet or something like that is the fact that I don't like to exclude things. I mean, I'm not like a hog that wants to
Mhm.
eat everything, but I do like pizza. I do like cheeseburgers. I do like steak. And, I've tried in the past to do things to try to cut back, but it didn't work. But recently we had our firefighter physicals and my cholesterol's up and some other things. And so the reality of needing to address this is what pushed me to try to explore different ways.
Mhm.
And, when you talk to a firefighter, first thing they almost always mention, "Oh, I'm on keto, I'm paleo, I'm carnivore." There's always a different supplement, a different diet, a different thing that they try, and sometimes it's very effective, and sometimes they go from one to another. But when we talk about intuitive eating, you talked about how it's not a diet, but yet
Mhm.
it's more or less a lifestyle change or a mental mindset change. But I know there are some basic principles that go with intuitive eating. What
Mhm.
are those principles? I mean, just kind of give us a thumbnail sketch so people can understand where we're coming from.
Yeah, definitely, and that's an important part of it because a lot of people do have a misunderstanding of what intuitive eating is. They often take the words intuitive and eating and kind of apply the natural English meaning to those and say, "Oh, well, that's how I got in the mess I'm in the first place was just eating intuitively, which is eating whatever I want whenever I wanted and not really thinking about it." And that's not at all what intuitive eating. I often say intuitive eating, capital I, capital E, because I'm referring to a particular framework that was developed by two registered dietitians 30 years ago. So it's been around for quite a while. And one way that is a great description of it is called. They refer to it as a self-care eating framework that integrates instinct, emotion, and rational thought. And I think that's a great way to summarize the 10 principles, which I'll go ahead and summarize here too in a little bit more detail. But it really is about that. It's a way of taking care of yourself in a way that addresses the needs of your body as a unique individual, since we're each very different. Your firefighter, firefighters may be listening to this. They have particular energy needs that are probably quite different than your average software engineer. Of course, I do rock climbing 3 days a week, and so my energy needs are going to be different than somebody who doesn't do that and who maybe does yoga or who maybe doesn't exercise at all, but still lives, maybe they're active, they go walking and hiking and those kinds of things. And so it's going to be different from person to person. So, uh, but I'll just summarize these principles real quickly here. So there's 10 specific principles and they each build on each other. And that's really the key to intuitive eating and really making it work, in quotes, I guess, for a person. One thing before I do get into that is it is considered what we call a non-diet approach, and so the goal of intuitive eating when you're applying these principles is not for the purpose of losing weight. So that's a tricky one for a lot of people. It's not designed or for the purpose of intentionally losing weight. Although when people apply it, if there were some disruptions in their life or some things that were out of whack that resulted in their weight being elevated beyond where their body naturally would like to sit, then when they get those things in line and that kind of a thing through developing those intuitive eating principles, sometimes their weight does drop. So it's but often what we find, and this is kind of the first principle, is rejecting the diet mentality. And so that is actually kind of going at it from the approach where you say, you know what, okay, I'm going to go ahead and step back from this constant pursuit of trying to lose weight, since that's kind of a pretty common thing for dieting, for changing up diet. I mean, people are doing that often just to try and lose weight. But even if your purpose is to intentionally bulk up or gain weight, sometimes it can be really emotionally and physically taxing to do that. And so that first principle is just rejecting the diet mentality, which is putting weight loss or whatever intentional changes in your body shape and size on the back burner so that your focus isn't on what's the scale telling me. So you're not getting up every morning, jumping on the scale and letting it dictate how well you're doing or how poor you're doing. You basically put that aside and say, I'm going to focus on these other things. And so then the other principles are honoring your hunger, which makes a lot of sense. Our bodies are designed in such a way to we have these innate hunger signals that drive us to get food and energy, and they're super needed and necessary. They help us survive and to get the energy we need for whatever level of physical activity we're engaged in each day. So this principle is honoring that. So when your body is telling you, I need more fuel, then you honor that by providing that fuel. Then another one of the principles is making peace with food, and that is basically stopping this fight with thinking about food as good and bad, healthy, unhealthy. It's not that some foods aren't more beneficial or less beneficial to us from a nutrient perspective, but basically trying to put all foods on neutral playing fields from an emotional, psychological perspective. And that's a really big part of what intuitive eating helps people to do is to kind of neutralize food. So you're not looking at ice cream as bad or a cheat. You're looking at it, hey, I enjoy ice cream and I enjoy it in this context and for this purpose, and so I'm going to eat that. But of course, then there's another principle, which is feeling your fullness, and that's again, so you have your honor your hunger, uh, this making peace with foods, where we call it unconditional permission to eat, basically that you're giving yourself. But then you have the fullness aspect, which is another part of that that you would respect. So you honor your hunger, telling you when you need more, respecting your fullness. Hey, I'm full. My body's clearly telling me I don't need more, so I'm going to stop. And so again, it comes back to that self care. It's all about taking care of your body. A couple other principles that kind of fall in this area are challenging the food police. So this is where you would throw out those food rules that you may have, like no carbs after 2, or I have to eat X amount of this particular food, or I can only eat desserts 1 day a week. These kinds of things, these arbitrary rules that really don't have the kind of effect that a lot of people think they do, at least from a long term perspective. We're not saying that, oh, well, then it's okay to just eat fast food 3 meals a day every day. Of course, we're not saying that. That would be ridiculous. But
Yes.
we're also not saying you can only have it on Friday. So at
Right.
the same, it really is going to be very much individual. And through this process, as as we talk more, you'll find that I've really helped people to focus on, well, why is it that you are, a person may say, I feel like I'm eating far too much fast food and stuff like that. And so we explore what it is that's driving the eating of that kind of food if they really aren't wanting to eat that way. And often we uncover things as simple as eat a snack in the morning and then you won't feel the need to stop on your way home from work. Real simple things like that. So we address the root issue instead of instituting arbitrary rules like that food police kind of thing. Another principle is discovering the satisfaction factor, which is eating for satisfaction and learning and understanding the importance of that when you are honoring your hunger, feeling your fullness, but you're also making sure you eat for satisfaction. Because what we find, and the research backs this up time and time again, is that when people institute lots of restriction on their eating, overly restrained eating, then what happens is that they seek that out anyway. So let's say you don't allow yourself to eat. Maybe you're in the mood for just something sweet, and all you needed was just a couple of pieces of chocolate. But you say, nope, I can't have it. It's not my cheat day, so I'm not going to have chocolate. And then I'm going to have a chocolate flavored rice cake instead. And so we try and trick ourselves into that, or eat Halo Top ice cream, or something that's not really going to hit the spot like the real thing would. And then what we find is that we eat that and it's not satisfying. And then we continue seeking out the satisfaction. So then we eat another rice cake, or then we eat a granola bar, or then we eat and when we could have just had the 2 pieces of chocolate and then been fine and moved on. And so there's not only the emotional aspect that can interfere with and cause problems with, but also tends to drive us then to actually end up overeating, which is what we're trying to prevent. So it's really interesting how these little tricks that we do can backfire significantly. Another one is coping with your emotions with kindness and without necessarily using food. And so again, exploring what it is that's driving the eating rather than trying to just cut it off. What are you trying to use food to cope with? Can we find better coping mechanisms that would actually meet your needs rather than mask them? The same principle with alcohol. Why is a person drinking so much alcohol? It's not enough to just not drink alcohol anymore, although that might be helpful. But really, to keep that, to stay on track with that, you need to figure out, well, what are you using it to cope with, and then can we find something else that would better help you cope with that need that's not being met. And then the last three are kind of interesting here. Another one's respect your body. Again, that comes back to that self care. All of these principles, hopefully, as you're kind of thinking about them a little bit, you're seeing how they all come back to respect for yourself and your body and taking care of it, not beating it into submission necessarily. But a couple that are really interesting too is one is movement, and we refer to it as movement in intuitive eating instead of exercise or training for a lot of people. It depends on the person. I consider, I do rock climbing, and I think of it as training. I have some structured training that I do to increase my performance there, but not everybody needs to do that or wants to do that. But yet, when we look at your typical fitness advice, everybody's told they've got to go to the gym, they've got to push hard, they've got to, do hard things, and no days off is another mentality, or don't skip your workouts, all this kind of thing. But instead, with the intuitive eating framework, we kind of help people to focus on finding joyful forms of movement that they truly enjoy that meet the goals that they have for themselves. Not everybody wants to be a, high level athlete. Not everybody needs to be at the condition of a firefighter, and they can still be healthy if they go for a walk every evening after dinner and play with their kids, and then on the weekends maybe take a bike ride, and maybe a couple of times a week they do a light resistance workout at the gym. They are getting 99% of the health benefits that you would get doing CrossFit 6 days a week, that kind of a thing. And so helping people to recognize, you know what, you don't have to beat your body into submission if your goal is just to simply be healthy and have a long life. My mom's a great example of that. She does not exercise, she doesn't enjoy it, but she's active, and she is in her mid 70s, literally doesn't take a single pill for any medical condition or anything like that. Um, so you don't have to do those extremes. And then the last one is maybe saying, well, you throw out all the food rules, eat to hunger and fullness. What about nutrition? Well, that's where we put in, we honor our hunger with what we call gentle nutrition. And so we don't toss out all the rules and just say, eat whatever you want. We get to a point where we neutralize foods. And so they're all on an equal playing field from an emotional perspective. And then we start to look at, okay, well, what do I need here? Um, I'm having some digestive issues. What foods bother that or exacerbate that? I'm dairy intolerant. I'm not. I'm saying a person might be dairy intolerant. So obviously, cutting back on dairy or restricting it would be a gentle form of nutrition that's going to benefit their body, which is very different than me cutting out dairy because the diet told me I had to do it. So we can still think of things from the perspective of nutrition and protein needs. So firefighters, they are going to need a high amount of protein, higher than the average desk person. And so the intuitive eating framework does also help you when you start to apply those principles of gentle nutrition. We can look at what the importance of protein is, but we can do all of this without this restriction or trying to fit into some rigid um, dietary program of some kind. So hope that's just a real quick overview of it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I've heard you mention in multiple different ways is about making peace with food,
Mhm.
you know, treating your body well, honor your hunger. So there seems to be almost a spiritual or mental aspect to how you're approaching food here. And I know there's a couple of guys that are getting ready to hit the switch right now and turn the podcast off. Pull your hand back. Hang on a second. Um, this is not some kind of mystic thing. And one of the biggest things for me personally that I've figured out since I started listening to your podcast and kind of following what all intuitive eating is the fact that I think about why do I want to eat. Like one
Mhm.
night I came home and I had dinner before I went out, and when I came back, I'm like, man, I just want to eat. And then I stopped, and it's like, I'm eating because I'm kind of frustrated, and the
Mhm.
situation that I just dealt with was frustrating. It's like, hey, wait a minute. And then when I thought about it, it's like, nah, probably I can put that down. And so I'm trying to be more cautious and aware of what I do. And I know a lot of times if you sit around the dinner table, whether it be at the firehouse, the lunch table, even at home, everybody's got their cell phone out. Everybody's looking at their tablet. They're watching TV, whatever the case is, and you're not paying attention to your food. And
Yeah.
just slowing down, huge difference in what it can do. But I know that your target audience, I guess, for your program, I know there's lots of other intuitive eating coaches around and a lot of other podcasts. The thing that really drew me to your program is the fact that you specialize in working with men and
Mhm.
men's specific needs situations. I think you would, and this is just me speaking unprofessionally, you would probably find less occurrences of things like bulimia, anorexia, the type of typical eating disorders you think of, particularly with females. That's something that we were always taught in health class, which I know that's not 100% true, but it's a whole different set of things that men need to work on. So, how can these principles that we talked about, how can they specifically benefit men? Because a large part of our audience and firefighters across the country are males. How can they
Mhm.
benefit from this information?
Yeah, well, they benefit from it in the same way that women do, which is really interesting because um, they're estimating that 40% of the people with eating disorders are men,
See, I
which,
stand corrected.
I, yeah. So when you were telling me that, I was like, yeah, and that's what the general population seems to think about eating disorders, that it's not something that affects men very much, and that there's a lot of stigma with that because especially with firefighters listening to this and other maybe first responders who might be listening, is that it's the same kind of thing that you think of in a locker room of a sports team. I played baseball and stuff in high school, and you know you just don't express weaknesses like that. And so the reason that we don't see it in, we assume that it's kind of a female thing, is that men just don't talk about it. But they struggle with it in with bulimia and anorexia. The most common eating disorder is actually something called binge eating disorder, and that's basically it's similar to bulimia in that you engage in these excessive binge eating episodes where you literally feel out of control. You eat to the point of painfulness and that kind of a thing, but there's no compensatory behaviors like purging or excessive exercise in response to it, which are some other characteristics of the other ones. But binge eating disorder is extremely common. And I can probably, without hesitation, unless there's only two or three people listening to this podcast, I can tell you that there are probably people who are either have binge eating disorder or are kind of on the border of what would be clinically diagnosed as binge eating disorder, where you engage in those binging episodes. And so it's really fascinating. And so that's why it is something that is definitely for men too. And one of the unfortunate things is that if you go out there and start to Google around for information on intuitive eating, you're going to find thousands of women's sites talking to women about this stuff. There just aren't very many men doing this kind of work and addressing these topics and directing them toward men. And it's not that the women are trying to exclude men; it's just that they went through some issues, and so they are trying to help other women. Now, it does manifest itself differently in men. Like in women, a lot of times there is sexual trauma that is in their past in some way or another, or some kind of abusive relationships and that kind of thing. Of course, that happens for men too. They just don't talk about it. They talk about it even less than women do. But often there's different driving factors. There's society's pressure that is on women to look a certain way. But of course, men experience a lot of that too. So it's maybe not as extreme, but men are also pressured to reach a certain level of muscularity and a certain level of leanness. So not necessarily thin and that kind of a thing, but there are some standards that society pushes on us and gives us the impression that we should aspire to that. You hang out in a fitness group for men for any amount of time, and you're going to hear them talk. Do you even lift? The guy, they'll make fun of guys who don't even look like they lift, and they'll there's a lot of pressure to work out in a certain way, to train in a certain way, to beat your body into submission in a certain way. And that I just saw one today where it was basically, it said all men squat, some lift heavy, and or some squat with heavy weight, and some squat to pee. So it was this like this this insinuation that if you aren't lifting heavy weights, that you're basically a girl. And
Yeah.
so there's that kind of thing, and those are the kinds of messages that a lot of guys are getting. And so coming back to intuitive eating, it really does help. It helps free up a lot of guys from the pressure, and realize, oh yeah, I struggle with my relationship with food. I feel out of control around food, but I don't want to admit it because then I look undisciplined and I look weak. And so they may not talk about it, but in reality, behind the scenes, they actually do struggle with it a lot. So
Yeah. And when you if you listen to other people that are in kind of the realm that we are, Roger Sutherland, I know you've been on his
Oh yeah, yeah,
podcast
good
several
friend of mine.
times. He's been on ours. He's been on yours. He's what, when your name popped up the second time when I was listening to his podcast, is like, okay, I got to reach out to Jeff. We got to
Mhm.
talk. But one of the things that I have learned is that, with firefighters, you're talking competition level athlete fitness and a
Mhm.
lot of these guys, because I mean, what some of the guys on the truck are doing, I mean, is short of, running a marathon, like you say, lifting the heavy, and it all happens in a short period of time. It is 0 to 100 in no time at all. So a lot of times the weight isn't an issue. It's not the, you know, man, do I look slim? Do I make this turnout gear look good? They're not worried
Mhm.
about that. Are
Yeah,
they functional?
that's good.
Can they do what they need to do?
Mhm.
And intuitive eating plays into that very, very closely, because a
Yeah.
lot of times it's just, you got a weird schedule, you got to eat, you just burned a ton of calories. Okay, grab something and we got to go do it again. So intuitive eating does work in with the firefighter lifestyle in a lot of ways. I mean, it will take some modification, but definitely a proven methodology. But now, one of
Yeah.
the other things that you talked about, and I've noticed this with your app, because I've had a chance to play with it
Mhm.
significantly, is the fact that journaling is a huge part of what you do. In fact, you probably saw me over here writing. I've got my journal right here,
Oh, cool.
that I'm keeping notes in and questions and things like that. But what role does journaling basically play in analyzing how and why we're eating?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one tool that some people can use. And what's interesting is I think journaling is one of the best ways to address a lot of these issues. But I personally don't journal much. I like to talk things out loud. So for me, instead of writing it down, a lot of people find they write it down, and it's a way of kind of putting into words what they're feeling or dealing with. Me, I talk out loud to myself. So in the car, I'll often have conversations with myself, and that's kind of the way. But ultimately, they accomplish the same thing, which is to articulate what you're feeling. And if anybody listening has been through any kind of therapy or counseling, even just maybe a little bit, you know how important it is for when they ask you a question to kind of reflect on that and then come up with an honest response to it. And so that's where the journaling can be really helpful. One thing is it's private, so it's just you, and so you don't have to worry about if somebody's going to read your words and then think something negative of yourself. Often it's hard enough just to get ourselves to admit to ourselves that we have an issue that needs to deal with, or a weakness, or something that we're struggling with. And it can be even harder, especially for guys, to talk to another guy about those things too. So while honestly, I think being vulnerable with other men can be extremely helpful and is super valuable. And I wish it was much more the norm that it is. Journaling is another way that you can do that, where there isn't so much vulnerability, and but you can still accomplish the same thing by getting those ideas out there. And as you write them down, you can always go back and look at them again, whether it's earlier in the week or last month, and you can look at those things. I mean, think about it. A lot of the guys listening are probably pretty rigorous about their training. It's the same kind of a thing. You journal, you log about your training, so that you can go back and look at where were you last week, last month, last year, where are you now, how's what you're doing changing and impacting and growing and moving you toward the goals that you have for yourself. The same thing can happen with journaling, is that you use that as a tool to record where you are on a given day, and then you can go back to it later, um, and do that. So there's lots of different benefits to journaling. And with intuitive eating, since a lot of it is, it's very different than your typical diet, which is you follow these rules and then you get these results. Which, interestingly enough, the research shows that about 90, 95, whatever the research varies, but percent of people who, for example, intentionally try and lose weight end up regaining it. And about two-thirds of them regain it plus more. And so So we know that the, these strict, rigid um, programs to try and stick to a diet or an exercise program often are not very sustainable for most people. And so, what with intuitive eating, then, if there's much more of that reflection, and you're looking for ways that are going to fit in with your lifestyle to help you move toward those goals. And of course, journaling really helps you to stay kind of on target with that.
Very good. And that is so true. And one of the things that we've always talked about on the podcast here is that mental health among first responders is something that's been neglected for so long that we in a lot of ways we live in a toxic environment. And like you say, men are afraid to let other men know they're not all right. But
Mm-hmm.
that culture is changing, and so there's a lot of other issues that are going to come with that. And as you mentioned, journaling is a very private thing, but it's a way to put your ideas down and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that is a very important tool, whether it be tracking your workouts or even tracking how you're feeling that day. But
Yeah.
so with all of this coming up, I guess the question is, Jeff, why do we have you on here? And so I'm not going to say a lot about it, but you and I've been talking. I myself have been on a journey for probably about the last 6 months, and a lot of it has been focused on improving myself physically, mentally, spiritually, basically on all levels. I'm trying to improve, but the one area that I can't seem to get a handle on it myself has been the fitness and getting better physically.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm excited to say that we've got an upcoming project that our listeners will be having the privilege of hearing. Maybe they won't find it a privilege, maybe they'll be horrified, but they're gonna see my journey as I go through for the next few weeks to see if I can make my case better. And I'm going to be utilizing your software and your help. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm looking forward to it. So hopefully you'll have some good stuff for us when it's time to start.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. I thought when you brought up this idea, I thought, wow, this sounds really cool, because it's the kind of thing that I enjoy doing with other men, helping them in this area. But at the same time, I think it's fantastic that you're going to be sharing this with other men who are listening to your podcast, and I think it's a great way of modeling that vulnerability that hopefully will carry over into some other people's lives, and maybe they'll feel a little more comfortable being just a little bit more vulnerable, because it can make a huge difference. I said men struggle with eating disorders just like women do, and eating disorders are the deadliest of the mental health conditions that are
Yep.
out there, which people don't realize too. So, um, and they've gone way up since things like COVID. So
Hmm.
it's very clear that stressful situations bring on these issues. And so anybody listening to
Yep.
understand if you are struggling in this area, it's completely understandable and almost expected because of the nature of the kind of work that you're doing. You're not in a thing where your stress is not just your kid acting up at school and coming home with a bad report card. Your stress is literally putting your life on the line for other people on a daily basis, and potentially giving your life for someone else's in an effort to save them. And so that's a level of stress that those of us who don't aren't part of that can't even fathom. But the impact that those kinds of things have on your relationship with food and your eating habits, and your relationship with your body, how you think about your body and your body image, are just yeah, it's incredible.
Well, so we will be hearing a lot more from you in the coming weeks for sure, Jeff. But if people want to get a hold of you, learn about what you're doing, maybe even contact you for coaching or help or apps or village work, hey, we'll learn about that too. That's really cool stuff. How can they get a hold of you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, so most active on Instagram at intuative.eating.men, and I post content on there with various things. My podcast is called Non-Diet Companion now. And then I have an app called Non-Diet Companion. It's non-diet companion. You can find that on Apple or Google, and that provides the some cool journaling prompts and tools to help you kind of work on your relationship with food. Even if you are if you're still sticking to a particular diet, you can still use this to kind of help you think about your relationship with food in some other ways, track your workouts, those kinds of things. There's a cool AI feature in there too. But you can learn more at non-dietcompanion.com. and so those are the easiest ways to get a hold of me. Yeah.
Sure. And we'll have all those notes in our show notes at the end. And once again, Jeff, thank you for taking time to talk to us. And as we always say on All Clear, light your fire within.